Hello, Elder Smith here. Today I'd like to continue on with the book of Revelation, touching on the subject of the second church in Asia called the Church of Smyrna. This is in the second chapter, starting with the 8th verse. And unto the angel of the church of Smyrna write, These things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works, and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that ye may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give to thee a crown of life. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. He that overcometh shall not be hurt of the second death. Now, if you notice, this here is not as long as his words toward the first church, the church of Ephesus, and yet I feel like there's a lot of churches that can relate to the second one here. Jesus said that he knew their works and their tribulation and poverty. Now, there are churches out there that go through tribulation and poverty. They go through struggles. They try to keep their doors open, but they always seem to be in danger of closing through financial reasons and other troubles that come their way. Yet, Jesus said something that when taken on the surface sounds almost like a contradiction, but it's really not. The part that sounds contradicting is when he says he not only knows their tribulation, but he also knows their poverty. He says he knows their poverty, but then he says, but thou art rich. How can you be rich and have poverty at the same time? Poverty means that you're going through financial struggles, and that you are, if you're not poor, you're not that far from it. And yet Jesus said afterward, but thou art rich. So let's stop and think about that for a moment. How can you have poverty and be rich? Well, it depends on how you look at it. What do you have to be rich? It'd be very easy to say, well, you have to have money to be rich for one thing. You'd have to not be lacking in anything worldly. But I don't believe that's what Jesus was talking about when he said that they were rich. When he said he knew their tribulation and their poverty, he was acknowledging that they, in the sight of the world, were poor. They didn't have all the money in the world, and they were struggling just to get by. And yet, there are things that when we value things in our hearts, to us, they are treasures. To us, they are valuable, even if the rest of the world doesn't see it that way. And Jesus actually did say in the Gospels that to those who would sell and get rid of their belongings would have treasure in heaven. Now, when he said that, I don't believe he meant that there would be treasure in the eternal heaven that we go to when we die, but treasure that's in the kingdom that's here on the earth. For he says that the kingdom is in us. And he said, where your treasure is, there your heart shall be also. Treasure is anything you value. And if you value it and you have it, then you are, in fact, rich. May not be rich in the ways of the world or in the sight of the world, but in the ways of the Spirit and in God's kingdom, you are rich, and God acknowledges you as being rich. But that's a good kind of rich right there. That's where he was saying he knew their tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. They were rich in spirit. They were rich in the truth that God has given them. They were a church that was on the right path. To me, it shows that just because churches struggle doesn't mean that God doesn't care about them or God isn't blessing them. Sometimes you'll find that the churches that struggle the most may in fact be the churches that are in fact rich in the eyes of God. A church doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be magnificent to the eye. It doesn't have to have money stored away to show that they are rich in the ways of the world in order to be in God's favor. You can have tribulation and poverty and still be rich in the eyes of God. And if you are rich in the eyes of God, you are blessed. You are blessed with a treasure that's more valuable than anything the world has to offer. And he said that he knew the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Now, what does this mean? It'd be very easy to see it as God saying that there are those who claim to be Jewish by flesh and blood and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. But I don't believe that's what he's talking about. You see, God is the God that we worship is not a God that looks upon the outward man. He always looks upon the inward man. And even John the Baptist, when he baptized people, he looked upon the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, bear in mind, the scribes and the Pharisees were Jewish at the time. And I say at the time, it's because I believe that once our physical bodies cease to be alive, it comes down to what you are spiritually, what the inward man is. Now, by the outward appearance of man, which is flesh and blood, they were in fact Jewish. They were descendants of Abraham. But he said unto them to look not, and say not among yourselves that you have Abraham to your father. For I say unto you, God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. Which I believe he was talking about the Gentiles at the time. Could God take literal stones and raise up children unto Abraham? Yes, he could literally. But at the time, it was Israel that were God's people. Peter calls us in his epistle lively stones, stones that are alive, stones that are living. And Jesus is the chief cornerstone. But before that time, we were stones, but not lively ones. We didn't have life. Though our hearts beat and we were walking around, without God in our lives, we are dead. And yet, those are the very stones that God took and raised up children unto Abraham. It doesn't matter if you're a Gentile outwardly. If by flesh and blood you are a Gentile, God looks upon the inward man. And if God has touched your heart, he has circumcised you in the heart. And if he has circumcised you in that spiritual heart, you are a child of Abraham. What does this have to do with this scripture here? It's because there are those out there that truly believe that being a Jew outward is what counts. That if you are by flesh and blood a descendant of Abraham, then you are what is called a Jew. That's not how God looks upon it, not anymore. He looks upon the inward man, the spiritual man. It doesn't matter who your descendant is by flesh and blood, but who your descendant is in the spirit. All you Gentiles, if you have a desire to serve God and follow in his ways, and if you believe in God, that means God touched your heart. He has put his spirit into you. And if he's done that, guess what that means? It means you are a spiritual descendant of Abraham. Ye have Abraham to your father. You are a lively stone that has been risen up to be a child of Abraham by God himself. And what's evidence of that is the church. The church is supposed to be the city of New Jerusalem. The church of Christ himself is New Jerusalem. Though people believe that when the end comes, that a literal city will descend down from God out of heaven, I don't believe that. I believe the city has already descended down, and that is the church itself. And what makes it evidence is in Corinthians when it says Christ returns, he shall deliver up the kingdom. To deliver up the kingdom unto God, the kingdom's already here on the earth. So, for those who call themselves Jews and are not, are those who are Jews by flesh and blood, but are not Jews in spirit. That the inward man is not a Jew. For God looks upon the inward man, not the outward man. It doesn't matter where you descend from or what your flesh and blood is. None of that matters. What matters is if you have the Spirit of God. For God is a spirit, and he can only be worshipped in spirit and in truth. Flesh and blood does not please God, with the exception of when Jesus gave his own life to save us. That was the only flesh and blood that mattered to God, was the broken body of his Son and the blood that was spilt for us. But other than that, comes down to what the inward man is. For every body, no matter where you descend from, every body, every flesh and blood is tainted with sin, and only the Spirit of God is perfect. And when he puts a spirit into you, you are then a child of God, and that means you were even chosen before that. You were always a child of God because God elected you, but when he puts a spirit into you, that's the first time you are awakened, that you are made alive. You are quickened by the Spirit of God through his Son. It is then you are a new creature made in Christ. And though you may be a Gentile outwardly, you are a Jew inwardly, and that's what matters. You can rejoice because you have Abraham to your father. Now that's what it means by those who call themselves Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Just because people are Jewish by flesh and blood, that doesn't mean that they necessarily have the Spirit of God. That's not an automatic sign that they are one of his elect. If it were, none of them would have rebelled against God at the time. The kingdom would have never been rent away from them time and time again throughout the Old Testament. They would have all had the Spirit, and none of them would have driven each one another to go serving after other gods. That goes to show that they were all of Israel, but they were not all Israel itself. That's what Paul meant when he said, they are not all Israel who are of Israel, neither are they all children. But we, who are God's elect, and I would like to clarify, when I said what I said just a moment ago, I'm saying that just because someone is born of Israel in flesh and blood doesn't necessarily make them one of God's elect. I'm not saying that it doesn't mean they're not either. God has a people in every nation, kin, and tongue. Israel's no exception to that rule. And just as he has a people in every nation, kin, and tongue, there's a people in every nation, kin, and tongue that are not his people. And once again, Israel's no exception. Sometimes I think we have put so much focus on Israel. We put Israel, natural Israel, the country Israel, on a pedestal, but that we're not supposed to be putting that Israel on a pedestal. That pedestal is reserved for one and one alone, and that is Jesus. I know there are people out there that would like to believe that you could put both on one pedestal, but you can't. When Jesus gave himself, he gave himself for all his people, including those who were born in Israel, because they themselves were also with sin. They themselves could not obtain salvation through the keeping of God's law. And the fact that they failed time and time again, and all you got to do is read the Old Testament, and the evidence is written there in its pages, that they failed time and time again, and even the Old Testament ends with their failures being made known to them. Not saying that we are better than they are, because if God had chosen anybody else to establish his laws, in fact, if God had waited to the time when the U.S. itself came into existence, chose us, made us his physical people, and gave his laws to us the same way he gave them to Moses and his people, we also would fail over and over again, because we ourselves are also imperfect. We ourselves are with sin. We can't obtain perfection, not that way. We cannot earn it. That's why we needed his son. All of us did. Not just, Jesus didn't just die for the Gentiles. He died for those who were in Israel also. He didn't die for everybody in Israel. He died for those that were his. And like I said, just as there's a people in every nation, kin, and tongue that are his, there are people in those same kingdoms and countries that are not his. That's why it said that he shall save his people from their sins. Not save everybody, but his people from their sins. Rejoice, because it doesn't matter if you are by flesh and blood a Jew or by flesh and blood a Gentile. The fact that you believe in God means that he put his spirit into you, and that means you are one of his. You're one of his people. Jesus died for you because you are already one of his. And likewise, you have Abraham to your father. And as it continues on, fear not those tribulations that'll come your way. I believe a lot of these smaller churches out there can relate to the church of Smyrna. You may have troubles ahead of time. You may have times where we don't have to suffer persecution like we did back in the days of the apostles, although the way things are going, if the world is allowed to remain in existence long enough before Jesus returns, I imagine that before he returns that we will hit those times once again where we will be persecuted. But that's assuming if Jesus does not return before that happens. But I do honestly believe that the world is allowed to remain long enough. Yeah, that part is going to repeat itself again, and we may have to go through some of the worst tribulations that the Christians back then had to go through. But we do have struggles that we go through today. Not as bad as they were back then, but we do have struggles nonetheless. Fear none of those things. These are things that some of us must go through. And as he said, to those who are faithful unto death, Jesus will give us a crown of life. How is it that we have a crown of life? He isn't talking about heaven, because we're already going there, because he had died for us. He had bought us with a price. That crown of life is meant for us here on the earth. That's a blessing that we have, showing that we are alive. That's That's something that people will build it's not going to be a physical crown that we can literally see with their eyes, and yet people will see it through your works. Now, bear in mind, when I say works, I'm not saying you got to do these works to be saved, but there are works God has set for us to do. He has given us talents, and when we use those talents will double. And when they double, it will be evident. People will see it. They will recognize the spiritual blessings that has been given us. Always remember that. And especially remember that even when you are struggling, you as an individual or you as a whole church are struggling financially. You may be a small church, may not be as appealing in the eyes of the world as those huge mega churches or those churches that are beautiful to the eyes to behold. You may be a small church, and nothing wrong with that. In fact, God doesn't pay attention to those outwardly appearances. You should take care of the church to keep it in good condition, the building also, but God focuses on what's in here, most importantly, because if you have the right treasure in here, if your heart is in the right place, which is the kingdom of God here on the earth, which is the church, if that's where your treasure is, then guess what? Even when you're going through all the struggles, even when you have that poverty, as Jesus said, you are rich. And that's all I feel led to speak about for today. I thank every single one of you for listening. Remember, study to show thyself approved, rightfully dividing the word of truth. Put on the whole armor of God and fight the good fight.